I have a friend, a pastor, who is a singer. And after years of ministry, we often talk about the church and what feeds us. More than that, what feeds our faith. Her definition of church is this: church is where we get to sing in parts. We get to sing the classic hymns and the spirituals and some of the new songs that grab us. And we don't sing alone because we are with others who are singing with us. Yes, there are, I am aware, different musical abilities in every church, but when we all get together, we are singing, and each of us is playing a part. The trained musicians help those who think they can't sing at all. The choir is not performing for us, but leading us in our worship, our praise, and our prayers, which are, in the end, for God. Now, in the months that I have been with you, I have come to appreciate the way that musicians guide this congregation. You aren't afraid to sing new songs. You do sing the old favorites wholeheartedly, so thank you, Janet and Paul, and thanks wherever he is. And thank you to all the choir members, and thanks to all of you for your willingness and eagerness to sing God's praise. And I chose Psalm 98. It isn't the psalm in the lectionary today, but I chose this psalm this morning because I think it does speak of the role of music in the life of faith. It is true that the 150 psalms we have in our Bible were the hymns of praise and lament sung by ancient Israel. But there are a few, like this one, that actually speak of the role of music in our worship. Make a joyful noise. All of us can do that. Sing praise with lyre, trumpet. Join with all creation in praising the Creator. Now, in reading and studying this psalm, I could not help but notice the repetition of the word victory. What do we think of when we use that word? We do speak of election victories. We speak of victories in athletic races or competitions. It happens that Victory Boulevard, right here, was named in honor of the veterans of World War I. And so that victory reminds us of the military sense of the word. We sometimes speak of victories over challenges in life, addiction, illness, doubt, depression. Now, the psalmist may well have been thinking of a military or national victory, but the closing lines of the psalm remind us that biblical victory is, in the end, more about equity and justice than about competition or domination. God will judge the world, it says, with righteousness, and the peoples with equity. In his letter to the Galatians, the Apostle Paul speaks of Christian liberty, a freedom that I think is something quite different than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. True freedom, Paul says, is growing in our ability to freely choose God's ways in the world. Christian liberty is God-given, Spirit-driven free will. And here Paul speaks of the fruits of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit. If you were listening last week, you will know that I happen to believe that body and spirit are connected, that they are not at odds with one another. And so when Paul uses the word flesh, he is not speaking strictly of our bodily selves. Instead, He is speaking here, and you'll see it in the text, about desire, about our human longings, knowing that even our longings for good things can go wrong at times. We long for those things that are necessary for life: food, sleep, shelter, relationships, even sex, and financial security. And there is nothing wrong with any of those things. But we all know that we tend at times to want too much of a good thing, more than our fair share, and that is where desire itself goes wrong. I think that's what Paul means by the flesh. Now, I have to say that I didn't really enjoy reading that long list of the fruits of the flesh, but if you look at them, most of them have to do with competition, with strife between human beings, quarrels, disputes, enmity, jealousy. As Spirit-filled children of God, we have the possibility of choosing another way. And so Paul lays before us the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. And by the way, self-control is not willpower or even discipline. It is something more like common sense or moral wisdom. I do not think there is a war between body and soul, or even between flesh and spirit. We are, all of us, capable of leaning in one direction or the other at different times in our lives. The struggle between freedom and bondage, I think, is about relationships with people and with things that we love too much or too little. I think sin is more like an addiction than anything else. When we give ourselves to something, anger, envy, enmity, it begins to possess us. And Paul is reminding us that if we give ourselves to the Spirit, we will be possessed by God. Now, I have an avocado tree in my garden. Some years I get a bumper crop, and sometimes only a precious few fruits. Last year's heat wave sent the baby avocados to the ground prematurely. It was heartbreaking. This year is looking good, but I know it can get scorching hot again. I tend to see that avocado tree as a lesson in grace and in the fruit of the Spirit. There is very little I can do by myself to improve the crop beyond watering the tree in hot weather. The creative energy of the Spirit of life turns the flowers into small green buds and then into delicious fruits to be shared, if there are enough. The fruit of the Spirit, I think, is something like that. It is a choice, an intention, a deep desire to let God's gracious Spirit grow in us and work through us. Some people would call that liberty. Some might even call it victory, but the kind of victory where everybody wins. Now, the story of Elijah, and I'll call him Elisha only because it's easier to distinguish between the two. The story of Elijah and Elisha and the chariots of fire reminds us of the story of liberation known as the Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea, the crashing of Pharaoh's army. Did you notice that the Jordan River parts twice in this story? Israel's chariots and horses come to summon Elijah up into the whirlwind, this is an emotional story. Elisha is heartbroken that Elijah is leaving. Elisha wants to stay with the prophet to the very end, and in a way, Elijah doesn't die because his spirit lives on in Elisha. This story, is where we do get that phrase, passing the mantle from one generation to the next. And the prophet's mantle was a cloak or a cape. And Elisha literally took on the mantle of his mentor. Now, what does this story have to do with victory? I think it has to do with influence, with the power that we have to influence others for good or for ill. The story reminds us of the generations that have gone before us, those who have passed on to us our DNA, but also customs and traditions and cultures that make us who we are. So who has influenced you? A mentor or a teacher? Your parents or a close friend? Maybe it was a role model or an author or a character in a story, a hero or a saint. We all have influence over others, whether we know it or not. And as people of faith, our influence over others ought to be about love and compassion, not about competition or control. Who knows exactly how we got to be who we are? We all have ancestors who were saints and sinners. We have plenty of ungodly role models in this world, some of whom claim to be religious. Have you been Elisha to someone? Learning and absorbing and practicing the values you were taught? Have you had a chance to be Elijah to someone, passing on your deepest longings and life lessons? Now, I have had some wonderful teachers and mentors in my life, and I have to say some not so great. I confess I had some music teachers who made me feel very small and inadequate at times. But our high school orchestra teacher taught me something I've never forgotten. I played the viola when I was young, and I've taken it up again in recent years. I never had private lessons when I was young, and so I struggled to keep up, usually occupying the last chair in my section. What could be lower than the last chair viola in an orchestra, right? What Mr. Coe said to all of us was something like this: I honestly don't care if you go on to be a professional musician or even to pursue music after you graduate. What I do want you to learn is how to be part of a group where everyone matters, where all the players, no matter what their ability, are contributing to the whole. Everyone is crucial, he said, and everyone has a gift to share. That I've never forgotten, despite my viola playing. Right? That, I believe, is biblical victory. It is a win-win situation. Now, I do know that making music takes discipline and hard work, as most worthy practices do. I appreciate the hard work of singing in the choir, of conducting, of accompanying the singing, and I appreciate also the work of the people, which is our worship together, the praise of God. Now, maybe you're starting to wonder why we are about to sing Joy to the World in the middle of summer. Joy to the World is a Christmas carol, is it not? Well, no. It really was not meant to be that. And if you listen to the words, you'll see that there is no baby Jesus, no shepherds, no angels, no manger, no wise men. It is Psalm 98, set to music. The great hymn writer Isaac Watts, who composed these words, was a Christian, and he saw in this psalm the coming of Christ, but it was never intended. In fact, in Britain, they don't sing this as a Christmas carol as we do. Instead, we are invited to join with all creations, fields, floods, rocks, hills, and plains in praising God. Here we are reminded that joy is a fruit of the Spirit, and that God's reign is one of truth and grace, of wonder and love. So remember, God will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with equity.